you all so much for being here with us today as we come together to honor the 8 local men who lost their lives in World War I 100 years ago. 1 year ago, staff members Sarah Bergeron and Katie Clark, along with the support of our entire staff team and family members of these heroic men, embarked on a research mission to gather and compile their stories so that we may preserve their memory and legacy here forever. So much of the community house's history was never preserved. For the first 60 years of our existence, our operations were primarily driven by volunteer support. Therefore, the activities and events were unfortunately never formally documented or archived. But we do know some things, and we know with confidence that the Community House of Hamilton-Wenham is one of the few remaining community houses in the country, and that this organization and building was indeed founded and funded by George Snell Mandell and Emily Proctor Mandell in 1921, after they lost their youngest son, Samuel, in World War I, 6 days prior to the armistice. Together with friends and the community, they channeled their grief into creating a special place that would unite people and the community after the war. Because of the Mandell family's generosity and their dedication to creating this meaningful memorial to their son and others, they have left an impact and footprint on the lives of everyone that this organization has served for 98 years. 1,000 visitors, believe it or not, funnel through these doors every week for programs that promote the arts, enrichment, and community spirit. We are honored and humbled by this lasting gift from the Mandells, as we are keenly aware of the ultimate sacrifice paid by 8 men you will hear about this afternoon. It was through the profound loss of their son, children, family, friends, and community members that the Mandells, along with others, were inspired to take action and build a stronger community of which we all benefit today. So we begin the story of the community house today with just the very first chapter, which is a compilation of events that are and were significant to World War I and the lives of those who served. On behalf of us all at the Community House, we are grateful to have many family members with us tonight, today, to share these special stories with us. And at this time, I would like to invite Lily Shaw, Samuel Mandell's great niece, who has been a tremendous asset, if I could, an avid supporter of this project, to speak about her involvement and what it has meant to her. So please help me welcome Lily Rice to the microphone.
Okay, how's this? Katie?
Great.
That's our producer up there. Yay, Katie. Okay, so I'm Lily Rice Shaw. There's the Rice. There's the Shaw. Melissa asked me to am I too loud? Asked me to tell you today about my experience helping with this presentation and what it means to me. First, let me tell you what a wonder Melissa is. I don't know where she went, but she truly is. How much she has brought to this place as the president. Well, she's actually executive director. I got that wrong. And how proud the Mandells would be, as are the rest of us here. My early memories are of coming here with friends to see the movies. I know there's some other of you who remember that because we had some chat the other day out back. And I also remember typing up my father's report for the 75th anniversary of the community house. And Joanne Patton is here, and she remembers that too. It did not mean much to me then. Life was so different for my generation. Having been through the process of working with these talented people who work here, I have such respect for their presentation today and what they put into it. It means so much to us all. I think it was a real awakening what the Great War means to us here 100 years later. We were not around then, and we didn't have the education, at least my generation didn't, about this war to, quote, end all wars. It certainly did not. Let us never forget. This morning I saw the headlines in the New York Times. I don't know how many of you saw it. And of course, yesterday the Hamilton Chronicle had a story about this program. And I thought, at last, there's some presence given to this day. I've been looking for weeks, and I've hardly seen anything. This is the 11th day tomorrow of the 11th month of the armistice. It was actually at 11 a.m. in the morning, so if you've all heard the expression 11, 11, 11, that's where it comes from. I'd seen very little recognition of what we here were researching and producing in other places, and I wondered if it mattered. The New York Times said today, a century on, a question remains. Will or should this commemoration of Veterans Day or Armistice Day, as the date is known, be the last of this scale? Should the world continue to pause in silence to honor the sacrifice and bravery of those who fought on the ground and in the air? I think so. And because it connects me to my ancestors, it is even more significant to me. You see that handsome young man out front there. Just look at him. I mean, it's incredible to me. And the names of the others who gave their lives for our country. And they're just from this small community. It's important to remember. And thanks to my great-grandparents, George Snell and Emily Proctor Mandell, we have that opportunity here. These were just boys. They were teenagers, and some of them were in their 20s, who left their fields, their homes, their schools, and went to protect our peace. Some argue, this is also the Times, some argue that commemorations have become no more than lip service. But the warnings against collective amnesia go a long way back. Even in 1915, long before the armistice, one of the most quoted poems of the war by the Canadian military doctor said, imagined fallen soldiers warning the survivors, quote, if ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. You'll hear that later. To me, this history has never meant more than today. Learning about the war and the participation of Hamilton and Wenham, not to mention the millions of soldiers who fought in this horrific, most horrific war of all times. And personally, it not only brought me closer to my ancestors, but to members of the rest of the families related to my family. Some are here today. We've never met. Their name is Mandell. We're all meeting for the first time, but we share so much, and we're making connections, and we're building community, which is what this place is about. We're celebrating together, all of us here, just what my great-grandparents wished for. From the Times, in light of America's present-day passions over immigration, it is also worth observing that nearly a quarter of the draftees in 1918 were immigrants, the rest of an influx that had transformed America's demography to a melting pot of lineages. Even in this town, as you will hear, we had immigrants who volunteered for the war. It continues today in our daily lives, as does war. It's all around us. But we can pause today peacefully and remember and honor those who went before us. And we can continue to support this community house and all who work here, teach here, play here, and share here. It is our gift from the Mandells. Aren't we fortunate? Thank you for celebrating this tribute with us today.
May 2nd, 1916. Dearest mother and fam, we were waked up the other morning by the sound of nearby guns and bombs falling in the distance. I got into sabots and an overcoat and we all piled out. A German plane was overhead with its iron crosses shining, and several more were visible way up, while a French escadrille de chasse was just closing with them, and the machine guns were beginning to sputter overhead. The whole sky in their vicinity was white with shrapnel, and the guns were barking all around us. The street was crowded with soldiers, partly dressed, and everyone was giving a gasp of satisfaction whenever a shell came near a plane. The clipping shows what happened then. Only 2 of 5 got back. 5 enemy machines have dropped bombs in the district south of Verdun. Our battle planes started in pursuit and succeeded in bringing down 2 of them. A third was brought down by the fire of our special guns. A couple more were visible that afternoon, ducking into clouds, pursued by shrapnel and making off without doing anything. They are the only planes that have ventured over our lines for a long time. It makes you rather uncomfortable, though, when planes get into the clouds. I don't know whether I wrote you that 2 days after I got to the front, we sighted a plane for an instant as it flitted from one cloud to another directly overhead and paid no attention, thinking it French, till we heard the whir and crash of the bombs a short half-mile off. You can't identify or keep track of a plane in the clouds, and you're always sure it's an enemy and going directly overhead. Sunday, I attended a military funeral, one of our aviators. It was impressive with the soldiers and the crowd of aviators and others with all their decorations. Behind the casket walked the man's mechanic with a cushion on which were pinned his medals. Médaille Militaire, Legion of Honor, and Croix de Guerre with 4 palms. That evening, I was on night duty, and as I arrived at the hospital, which was on the heights, I could see incessant gun flashes and lingering illuminating rockets and red and green signal flares. Suddenly, all along the line went up the flares together that mean the artillery is to lengthen its range. We were attacking, and we knew we would have work later. Sure enough, at 1 o'clock, a constant stream came in. The Germans had been trying all afternoon to retake what they'd lost the day before without success. We counterattacked at night and raised Cain. The box had used fire, and the wounds were the most ghastly I had seen. I got a rush call and took a man in the death agony, all bandaged except an inch of gray-green skin around a foaming mouth. I thought he'd die in the ambulance, but by hard driving, I got him to the operating hospital before he died. I'm waiting in the hospital yard now and writing on my cushion. The band from the next town is giving a concert here and has just finished a tune, and you should have heard the pitiful, weak hand clapping from all the hospital tents. To return to night duty, I had a long trip to a little back village hospital among apple blossoms. It was dark night when I arrived, but as I waited to be unloaded, the sky got gray and all the birds started to sing. I drove back over the heights and saw misty purple valleys and a marvelous changing sky, with a little shrapnel fleece along the fringe of a dark cloud just as I got back. Also, airplanes were rising gray in the half-light and thus silhouetted against the vivid sky. I shan't forget that night. Oliver. World War I, or the Great War, was fought from August 1914 to November 1918. Within the first few weeks of World War I, it became clear that countries could not withstand the economic sacrifices necessary before collapsing into chaos. New equipment and techniques made the battlefields so lethal, armies could not endure the killing. By 1915, 1.75 million were dead in the West alone.
I think one really clear way of understanding the shift in World War I in terms of technology is that soldiers rode in on horses and they left in airplanes.
At the beginning of World War I, warfare is almost in the 19th century style. The French sincerely believe that going at the troops with determination, at enemy troops, is the way to go. What they don't understand is the collision of technologies.
General Pershing didn't believe in the trench warfare. He grew up on the plains fighting in Indian warfare where it was an open confrontation. So he trained his troops to fight in the open warfare. The British and French generals thought he was crazy. They criticized him for this.
It's impossible to cross that deadly beaten zone, the deadly zone between the two lines. The most determined line of soldiers cannot oppose a machine gun that fires hundreds of rounds a minute.
Soldiers who joined the war were largely comprised of single men in their 20s and 30s, and family men who had never expected to face the demands and horrors of war.
Every boy I ever danced with never came home.
Of the war, women saw their men swallowed up in the ever-increasing wave of death.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Today we honor the 8 local men who sacrificed their lives fighting for the rights of all humankind.
Love is so sweet in the springtime, when blossoms are fragrant in May. No years that are coming can bring time to make me forget you this day. I love you in life's gray December, the same as I love you today. My heart ever young will remember the thrill it knew the day in May. Sweetheart, 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 will you love me ever? Will you remember this day when we were happy in May, my dearest one? Sweetheart, sweetheart, sweetheart.
World War I began when Serbian terrorists assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in June 1914. Emperor Franz Joseph and Austrian leaders felt in order to protect the empire, they needed to destroy Serbia. Players in the deconstruction of Serbia were the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey on one side, and the Entente, or Allied powers of Serbia, Russia, France, Belgium, Great Britain, Montenegro, and Japan on the other. Most of Europe was at war by 1914. But under the leadership of President Woodrow Wilson, the United States did not enter the war until April 1917. But long before the U.S. entered the war, American men of all races and social statuses boldly ventured into the war alongside the French, many of whom were pilots. The following is a compilation of reenactments and real footage. This is a German dirigible captured by the British being used for an observation balloon taken from an airplane above the balloon near King's Lynn, Norfolk, England.
In every eye as the boys go marching by, what they're out to do, I hear them dream. All the things you plan to do, I am sure they will come true, and I'll walk and wait for you over here. Au revoir, but not goodbye, soldier boy. Brush that teardrop from your eye, soldier boy.
The life expectancy of a pilot in World War I was 20 days. More Americans lost their lives in World War I than in the Vietnam and Korean Wars combined. Aviation was an essential strategy in warfare, but new methods such as trench warfare and poisonous gas were introduced on the battlefields, and their effects were devastating.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Into thee!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time."
If you spent enough time in a trench, you likely contracted lice. trench foot, and other infections that reduced the quality of life or ended it. I think it's scary science. The thought that it gets into your system and you can't really see it. Unlike a piece of shrapnel or a bayonet wound. Gas, which moves like a vapor, brings to mind ghosts, phantoms, and things associated with death. As World War I raged on, Wilson remained an advocate for peace and neutrality. He gave the Allied troops what they needed to fight, but felt that America was better suited as a silent and supportive ally.
So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had from the very beginning an official policy of neutrality, but neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet, within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war.
While Wilson resisted, others were called to action. Though it was a death sentence to join this gruesome war, many young men felt a moral obligation to fight for the right to safety, security, and freedom. America, the land of the free, truly became the home of the brave. And these young heroes who sacrificed their very lives for the good of those who would come after them are honored and remembered for their selflessness. He was a man. Take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again. I'd like to invite Rebecca Gardner Campbell to share Major Augustus P. Gardner's heroic tale.
Good afternoon. Augustus Peabody Gardner was born on November 5th, 1865, to Joseph Peabody Gardner and Harriet Amory Sears Gardner. His parents died before their son reached the age of 10, and his two older brothers were subsequently raised by their uncle and aunt, John Lowell Gardner and Isabella Stewart Gardner, famously known as Mrs. Jack. The family lived in Boston during the winter months and summered on the North Shore in Beverly. Young Augustus was educated at Hopkinson School in Boston and at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, where he demonstrated a proficiency for challenging academics at an early age. He entered Harvard in 1882, graduated in 1886, and following graduation worked in the family business as an accountant. He acquired through purchase and inheritance Sagamore Farm in Hamilton, Massachusetts in 1886, and established himself as an industrious gentleman farmer raising Jersey cows and thoroughbred horses. He became a member of the Essex County Agricultural Society and eventually a shareholder of the Myopia Hunt Club, where he played polo and rode to the hounds. In June of 1892, Gardner married Constance Lodge, daughter of the prominent congressman, the Honorable Henry Cabot Lodge. At age 32, he registered and entered the Spanish-American War as captain, then colonel, and was promoted to assistant adjutant general. He served in 1898 and saw active combat at the Battle of Coamo. As a soldier, his commander, Major General James Wilson, said of him, "He is a very able man, is patient, painstaking, exact, and untiring in his work. Nothing ever deters him from getting to the bottom of any question or of carrying through any duty entrusted to him." Tributes, like those of his commanding officer, followed Gardner in every discipline he undertook for the rest of his life. Gardner, a member of the Republican Club of Massachusetts, where he served as secretary from 1899 to 1902, was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate in 1899. In that position, he was the author of a number of innovative bills, among which was the subway bill for the construction and ownership of the transportation system in the city of Boston. Numerous other resolutions that he developed were approved during his time in office, and as well, Gardner was chairman for the Committee for Industrial Arts and Expositions. In 1902, he was elected to the United States Congress, representing the 6th Massachusetts District, where he was a member of the Ways and Means Committee. When the war broke out in 1914, Gardner was determined to fight in the debacle that was happening in Europe, as he was concerned that it would ultimately affect the United States. He made the critical decision to resign his duties in the U.S. Congress on May 22, 1917, and he rejoined the U.S. Army. He willingly surrendered his previous and prominent rank of colonel and agreed to a demotion to the rank of major. The country and cause he served meant far more to him than the significant reduction of rank and status. Gardner's first military assignment was in New York at Governor's Island, and then at Camp Wheeler in Macon, Georgia. This facility was a tent camp and was completely unprepared to accommodate the troops. He worked tirelessly at Camp Wheeler, always hoping and expecting that deployment for combat in Europe would come any day. His greatest desire was to defend his country overseas, but much to his chagrin, that wish never materialized. But the service he performed for his country in and out of uniform was exemplary and was always held in the highest regard by his peers, military colleagues, and recruits. For his selfless nature as a civilian, a politician, and in military service, Gardner was awarded the Spanish Campaign Medal for his efforts in the Spanish-American War, the World War I Victory Medal, and ultimately the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously in 1923. Augustus Peabody Gardner, at age 52, succumbed to pneumonia at the base hospital camp at Camp Wheeler in Georgia on January 14, 1918, never having seen combat in France that he had so greatly anticipated, and he was interred at Arlington National Cemetery. His passing at such a relatively young age stunned all who knew him. In the U.S. House of Representatives, Wilfred W. Lufkin, who had succeeded Gardner, paid tribute in saying, "With the same courage which he ever displayed as a member of this House, with the same fortitude which characterized his action when the President called for volunteers, Augustus P. Gardner cheerfully answered and gave his life as a sacrifice to the cause for which he had not only preached, but practiced. Mr. Speaker, there will probably be many more sacrifices of good and true men before this terrible war is over. But when history is finally written, when the toll is at last complete, I am proud to think that there will be no soldier, be he officer or private, of whom it can more truly be said, he was a man, take him for all in all, I shall not look upon his like again." Thank you.
I would like to invite Vince Jones to share this dedicated airman's story.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking of Sergeant Norman Prince, who was first cousins to my maternal grandfather, Gordon Prince. Norman was born on August 31st, 1887 in Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts. His parents were Frederick Henry Prince, who was a well-known financier and industrialist, and his mother, Abigail Kingsley Norman Prince. His grandfather, Frederick O. Prince, had been mayor of Boston. His family owned several properties in Massachusetts, one being Princemere in Wenham, which became Gordon College, and in Rhode Island, the Marble House, and also a place in South Carolina. In addition, they owned a villa in France. Norman Prince was raised on the family estate Princemere, and as I stated, is now property of Gordon College. In the late 1940s, James Higginbotham, a student pastor at Gordon Divinity School, approached Frederick Prince about selling his Wenham estate. He sold the estate because he was impressed with Higginbotham, a 1,000-acre estate, to Gordon College for a very small sum, and then donated a larger sum to construct what would become the Prince Memorial Chapel on the site. In 1955, Gordon College moved to Wenham, selling its old facilities to the Wentworth Institute of Technology. Norman Prince attended Groton School and graduated from Harvard College cum laude in 1908, and then graduated from Harvard Law School in 1911. And he used his education to practice law in Chicago, but this was only for a short period of time. His true passion was aviation, whether it was building planes or flying them. He joined a group to build and race a plane in the Gordon Bennett Cup race. The group hired Starling Burgess to help build their plane, and the site of building it was at his boatyard in Marblehead, Mass. Together with Burgess, Prince built a handful of planes using engines that were designed by the Wright brothers. Prince used an alias of George Manor to conceal his flight training from his father. He was the 55th American to be licensed to fly an airplane by the Aero Club of America, and he passed his test on August 28, 1911 at Squantum, Mass., flying a Burgess with the Wright motor. In 1910, Prince's family had bought an estate in Pau, France, known as Villa Sainte-Helene. The estate with its house still stands at 29 Avenue, Norman Prince, and contains a painting of Norman standing next to an aircraft. The Wright brothers had traveled to Pau, and many of their well-publicized flights were there, carrying many passengers and training pilots. Admiring building and racing planes occupied most of his life up until 1915, when he realized the severity of the war in Europe, having summered there, decided to put his knowledge of aviation to use in the war effort. He voiced his opinion that it was criminal for the United States to sit idle and unprepared for the war. He advocated for the U.S. to build the largest Navy and to give all members airplanes. In January of 1915, Prince, who spoke fluent French, traveled to France and persuaded the French military to allow the founding of an American aviation unit. Captain George Thenol, commander, credited Prince for conceiving of the idea of bringing together his countrymen with some of those of the French Foreign Legion in a squadron of flyers that initially became the Escadrille Americaine. 2 years after its creation, the name was changed by the French to the more famous Lafayette Escadrille. It was named for Marquis de Lafayette, who we remember fought with the Americans in the Revolutionary War. It was a U.S. volunteer unit that operated from April 20th, 1916 until February 19th, 1918. Prince and Dr. Edmund LeGros are considered the founding fathers of the American Combat Aviation / Lafayette Escadrille. Prince was called the World War I Flying Ace, and his brother, Frederick Prince Jr., was also a member of the escadrille. In April, 7 Americans, including Prince and 2 French officers, were assigned to the Escadrille Americaine. However, many more young American men felt the call to fight in the Allied cause, even though the U.S. was not involved yet. In order to facilitate the enlistment of Americans into the French Air Service, the Lafayette Flying Corps was founded. The Corps helped 200 Americans join the French Air Service. Not all became a part of the Lafayette Escadrille. There were officially 43 men who were Lafayette Escadrille pilots, and 9 of those were killed in action. That's about 25%. The Lafayette Escadrille flew more than 3,000 combat sorties, and they downed 57 German airplanes and reported 39 confirmed victories. Their legacy was not only their service to France and the Allied cause, but they helped lay the foundation of U.S. air power. The Lafayette Escadrille was absorbed into the American Expeditionary Force Air Service on February 18, 1918, becoming the 103rd Pursuit Squadron. During his time in the war, Prince engaged in 122 aerial combat missions. Despite his poor eyesight, he was officially credited with 5 victories, although there were thought to be more that were not officially documented. For his leadership and bravery in the battles, he was awarded the French Legion of Honor, which is the Médaille Militaire, and also the Croix de Guerre, and he was promoted to sous-lieutenant just before his death. Norman Prince's final battle became October 12, 1916, during which he flew as an escort for a bombing raid on the Mauser Rifle Works at Oberndorf, Germany. He completed the mission and shot down an enemy plane in the process. And returning home, he was attempting to land his Newport back at Corso Airfield in Alsace when tragedy struck. His landing wheels hit an elevated telegraph wire, just yards from safety. As a result, his plane flipped over and crashed, leaving Prince severely injured, breaking both his legs and suffering a brain trauma. He died 3 days later in a hospital from his injuries on October 15, 1916, at the age of 29. Military funeral services were held in France on October 20th. Norman Prince's body was initially interred in Luxeuil. His remains were later placed in the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial Tomb at St. Cloud near Paris. It remained there for 20 years. Then, in 1937, his father, Frederick, had it moved to what would be his final resting place, an elaborate tomb within the National Cathedral down in Washington, D.C. And on his tomb read the words, "They led where a nation followed." There are many memorials to Norman Prince, The Norman Prince Neurosciences Institute was established by his family at the Rhode Island Hospital. He had been honored in Massachusetts by the DCX, which is the Drum Corps Experience. In Melrose, Mass., there was a Veterans of Foreign War post named Lieutenant Norman Prince Post 1506, and that was established in 1946. There's a group called the Princeman Drum and Bugle Corps, and in Malden, Mass. In the same year, the Lieutenant Norman Prince Renegades were formed. Both are part of the Drum Corps Heritage Society.
Back in the U.S., Wilson was faced with facts that make it nearly impossible to resist entering the war.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the U.S., Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the U.S. and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the U.S. into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the material, and the resources that these allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
The United States will fight only as a champion for the rights of mankind to make the world safe for democracy. Many young Americans had volunteered to fight alongside the French, but Wilson knew this number would not be adequate to stop the Germans. He signed the Selective Service Act in May 1917. Men 21 to 35 had to register for the draft, which made our prior army at 200,000 a solid 4 million by the end of the war. No one was excluded from the draft. Though we fought, Wilson had a vision for restructuring after the war. In January 1918, he delivered an address before a joint meeting of Congress known as the 14 Points. These points outlined his vision for stable, long-lasting peace. He itemized 14 strategies to ensure national security and world peace.
It's time to place a musket on his shoulder and wrap the stars and stripes around his breast. It's time to shout those noble words of Lincoln and stand up for the land that gave you birth. That the nation of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Boys of America, get ready. Your motherland is calling you. Boys of America, be steady for the old red, white, and blue.
Victory Gardens. farmerettes, 4-H clubs, and war bonds are just a few of the terms that described life in America during the war years. While husbands, sons, brothers were overseas fighting, women and children were keeping the home fires burning and hoping always their loved ones would return. Home fires and factories, farming and rationing is what kept America going during those years. When they had finished those tasks, they often joined their mothers in victory gardens, tilling the soil, weeding and watering, while other resources were conserved and sent over to overseas to the fighting men. Boys across America delivered and hung posters and flyers that promoted patriotism and self-sacrifice. One poster proclaimed, "Food is ammunition. Don't waste it." Boys canvassed door to door, selling war bonds, and some worked in mines, munitions factories, and farmed the land with their mothers and sisters. Our next hero's family members are responsible for the creation of the community house. Lieutenant Samuel P. Mandell II enlisted just 29 days before Wilson declared war. I'd like to invite Charles Rice Kendall to share Lieutenant Mandell's story.
Lieutenant Samuel Pierce Mandell II would be my great-uncle, my grandfather's uncle, who my grandfather was born in 1918, and his wife is sitting right here in the front row. Great-great-uncle. Thank you. Samuel Pierce Mandell II was born in Boston on March 20th, 1897, to parents George Snell Mandell and Emily Proctor Mandell. George Mandell was owner and editor of the Boston Transcript, the leading newspaper in Boston. They had a home on Commonwealth Ave in Boston and an estate in Hamilton. Much of Mandell's childhood was spent at the family home, now Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, right here in Hamilton, full of horseback riding, hunting, polo, steeplechasing. Mandell attended Noble and Greenhouse School and St. Mark's School, class of 1915, and entered Harvard University as part of the class of 1919 with several honors. Barely more than a teenager, Mandell left Harvard during his sophomore year to join his fellow Harvard colleagues who were receiving aviation training at flying schools in different parts of the East. They were focused on the serious attempt to become qualified military aviators. There was no USA Air Force at that time. Mandell and 4 others of these undergraduates from Harvard received certificates as finished aeroplane chauffeurs. Mandell officially enlisted in Newport News on March 3, 1917, and resumed flight training at another commercial school. Despite drawbacks and delays caused by lack of machines, instructors, and inferior parts, Mandell eventually qualified as a pilot in July. He then attended MIT for ground training and was commissioned a first lieutenant on November 5, 1917. That December, he embarked for France and trained in various camps throughout the country. Upon completing his training in September 1918, he was assigned to the 20th Aero Squadron, a group with the First Day Bombardment Group. He was sent to the front, based initially at Toul and subsequently at Moulins. The squadron's very first flight was to take part in the Saint-Mihiel drive. This is a quote: "In driving rain and hail, weather such as none of them had ever seen before, they were permitted to venture out. These untried men were sent to support the American attack." In his first flight over the German lines, Mandell shot down a German Fokker. In all, Mandell participated in 17 raids that were made by the squadron. This comes at a time when just getting off the ground was dangerous. For this achievement, he and the survivors of the original group received a citation for having shown a devotion to duty and initiative. The First Day Bombardment Group was America's first attempt at such works, and mistakes from lack of experience were made both in tactics and equipment that sacrificed many lives. The First Day Bombardment Group was comprised of the 96th, 11th, 20th, and 166th Aero Squadrons. The 20th Aero Squadron, along with the 11th, was the first to be equipped with American machines, de Havilland 4s with Liberty motors. These machines quickly earned the nickname Flying Coffins from the vulnerability of the gas tank, which was located directly between the two seats in the plane. In the front was the pilot. There was another seat for the observer. This made a third vital spot as a target for enemies, not just the engine and the pilot, but also this gas tank. It also separated the pilot from his observer and made communication difficult. In such machines, they were asked daily to face death, and in pitiably small groups. These young Americans were called upon to meet tremendously predominating forces. Mandell's last flight began on the morning of November 5th, during the last American air raid and the final major Allied offensive of World War I. The Meuse-Argonne offensive stretched along the entire Western Front. It was fought from September 26, 1918, until the armistice of November 11, 1918. Total of 47 days. It was the largest and deadliest battle in the United States military history, involving 1.2 million American soldiers. It was one of a series of Allied attacks known as the 100 Days Offensive, which brought the war to an end. The battle cost 28,000 German lives, 26,277 American lives, and an unknown number of French lives. The U.S. losses were exacerbated by the inexperience of many of the troops and the outbreak of the Spanish flu. Meuse-Argonne was the principal engagement of the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I. Mandell's squadron's objective was to cut off the railroad station and storage warehouses in Mouzon, just south of Sedan. There were 9 planes total. Mandell and his observer, Lieutenant R.W. Fulton, flew in group number 2 in the V formation. Returning after having successfully bombed their objective, they were attacked by 3 patrols of German Fokkers. The engine on Mandell's ship was shot dead and lost an aileron while 12,000 feet in the air. They went into a downward spiral and were able to regain control several times as they were heading down, the last recovery being less than 100 feet from the ground. They landed in a small field within a few yards of a canal at Martincourt by the Meuse River. Fulton was virtually unhurt, and instead of escaping from German forces, chose to help his comrade Mandell, who was gravely injured and his leg broken in several places. Fulton was able to remove him from the wreckage. A German officer on the other side of the bank instructed 3 of his men to swim across the canal to Fulton and the injured pilot. They aided Fulton in administering first aid to Mandell for 20 minutes before the German officer gave another command, this time for them to take Fulton as prisoner. They left the wounded pilot propped up against his plane. The German officer spoke perfect English and promised Fulton that he would send medical aid if possible. He never did. Fulton escaped at a later date. What I'm going to read next sort of is a combination of multiple different accounts, one coming from local French villagers, another coming from Fulton, and then others who had American soldiers who had sight of the incident. This compilation is sort of a PG version and combination of all 3. Later that day, November 5th, 1918, with the Germans in retreat. If you remember, Sam is still sitting by his plane. Another German officer came along and upon seeing Mandell took a rifle from one of his guards and deliberately fired a number of shots into the helpless American, killing him. Thus Mandell was wounded and later shot in the last flight made by his squadron just before the armistice was signed. On November 7th, the villagers were ordered to leave town and were not able to return until the 13th. Finding Mandell still in the same place, a villager informed an American soldier who spoke French. However, it was not until November 17th that a detachment from the 5th Marines passed through the town and was notified by the townspeople of the dead aviator. Reverently, they buried him right where he was. That was 11 days after his death. Shortly after his burial, however, the Meuse River overflowed her banks. The spot where he was buried lay underwater. Sometime after this flood, news of Mandell's death and whereabouts came to Lieutenant John S. Pettit of the 58th Field Artillery, a friend of Mandell's from back here. He immediately arranged for a reinterment. With military honors, Mandell was laid to rest in a little country churchyard on the hill nearly opposite where he fell. The grave was carefully tended to by the villagers who felt affection for the brave young American, the only one to have lost his life in their little town. Later, his body was again transferred to the little U.S. military cemetery between Beaumont and Latane. The Army Air Service Commander, 1st Army, by order of Colonel Milling, cites the following officers and men for exceptional devotion to duty. 1st Lieutenant S.P. Mandell, A.S., USA, as pilot of the 20th Aero Squadron 1st A Bombardment Group, participated in every raid made by the squadron in the Argonne Meuse sector of October 1918. News of Mandell's death reached his father by cable in January 1919. Services in his memory were held at Emmanuel Church in Boston on Wednesday, January 22, 1919, officiated by Reverend Elwood Worcester, rector of the church, and Reverend William G. Thayer of St. Mark's School. The obituary in the Boston transcript stated that his body rests on the bank of the canal where he fell. In 1920, Emmanuel Church installed a beautiful triptych stained glass window in the entrance hall. It is in honor of parishioners who lost their lives in World War I. All of the young men's names are carved in the stone wall. Lieutenant Samuel Pierce Mandell II is one of those names. Mandell was 21 years old and one of 20 members of Harvard's class of 1919 who lost their lives in World War I. On Armistice Day, 1932, Memorial Church at Harvard University was dedicated in memory to those who died in World War I, a gift of the alumni to the university. Above the names from all the wars is the inscription, "While a bright future beckoned, they freely gave their lives, and fondest hopes for us and our allies that we might learn from them courage in peace to spend our lives making a better world for others." It was thought that Mandell's body remained in France until descendants of the Mandell family recently discovered that there was a tombstone at the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, bearing Mandell's name alongside his parents and brother, James. Puzzled by how his body came to Mount Auburn from France, further investigation brought to light that at the end of the war, U.S. military leaders balked at the thought of bringing some 70,000 bodies back to the U.S. from France. However, in response to thousands of families demanding the return of the war dead, this was unusual. This was never done in any other conflict. The War Department announced in October 1919 that it would survey each of the fallen soldiers' next of kin, asking their preference to bring home the remains or have them buried in the newly created American military cemeteries in Europe. In late 1920, the French yielded to American pressure and lifted their ban on the return of bodies. The United States spent the next 2 years recovering its dead, returning the remains of some 46,000 soldiers to their families, while burying another 30,000 in local cemeteries. On July 10, 1921, the first transports bringing home American war dead arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, met by General Pershing himself. Caskets with the remains of 7,264 men stretched out on the pier for a quarter mile. Their caskets arranged before him, Pershing stood straight and tall and delivered an emotional tribute to all the Americans who had died in the war. He spoke of men who deserved great glory because they had fought for freedom. They gave all, he said, and they have left us their example. It remains with us, for us, with fitting ceremonies, tenderly with our flowers and our tears, to lay them to rest on the American soil for which they died. Soon, each was returned to his hometown and buried with honor by friends and family. It's apparent that Mandell's casket was one of these, as funeral services were held for him the next month. On August 6, 1921, almost 3 years after his death, Mandell was honored at a funeral service in his parents' home in Hamilton. The service was conducted by Reverend William Greenough Thayer, D.D., headmaster of St. Mark's School. After the brief service, the body of the young World War I veteran who was in the aviation service was taken to Mount Auburn Cemetery for burial in the family plot. His body was brought to this country from France on the steamship Cantigny. It is interesting to note that the Boston Globe reported on December 31st, 1929, that Boston paid tribute yesterday to the New England aviators who gave up their lives in World War I by establishing the Memorial Administration Building and Control Tower at the Boston Airport in East Boston. There are tablets bearing the names of the New England men killed during the war. Mayor Nichols spoke touchingly of the young men, aviators, and public tribute to Mr. and Mrs. Mandell's cooperation in making the airport reality, the best of its type in this section of the country. Thank you.
How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, fears relief. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed.
I would like to now invite Lily Shaw to tell us about her trip to France and her journey to find Uncle Sam.
Would you like to introduce yourself? Can you tell them who you are?
I am Lila Lily Kendall.
And you're whose granddaughter?
Lily's.
Okay. This is I think, quite a moving story for us. So, it's kind of hard to tell, but I will. Thank you, Rice. It's very hard to follow that. It was not until recently, after my father, C.G. Rice, whom most of you know, a lot of you know, died, that my son Rice and I came across family memorabilia in his office at the farm. At this time, we were particularly interested in my great-uncle, Lieutenant Samuel Pierce Mandell II, as the 100th anniversary of World War I was looming. We knew that his statue was in the portico of the community house in Hamilton, and that the building was built in tribute to him by his parents, George Snell Mandell and Emily Proctor Mandell, my great-grandparents, but not much more. So Rice and I spent hours studying publications. Actually, he did most of it, because he had Sam's books, which are out here on display. Handle carefully. A lot of the pictures you saw today. It really is a treasure to have those. We studied the photos and Sam's life and my grandmother's scrapbook, my father's books, whatever. But we were stymied as to where Uncle Sam really came to rest. Rice told you about the many times he was moved. Was he still in France on the bank? See, this is before the end that you just heard. So I'm telling you about, am I making sense? So, but we were stymied where Sam finally came to rest. We didn't know that. Was he still in France on the banks of a river, up on the hill above the flooded river, or in a small village churchyard cemetery, somewhere over there? Many stories from those who were there, news reports, army records, and personal letters all told different versions. The idea of taking a family trip to France to find Uncle Sam came up. So we decided we'd go. And who went, Mila?
Bobo, John, Lily, and my daddy and me.
So that's 3 generations. Bobo John would be John Shaw, my husband, right there. So, okay, we got our tickets and we were ready to go. Off we went, 3 generations. My cousin Helen Patton, granddaughter of General George S. Patton and daughter to Joanne Patton, who's here with us today. I'm sorry Helen couldn't join us. She had hoped to, but she's busy in Washington, and you'll hear more about that later. So anyway, she helped arrange what we should see and do, as she lives over there and is very involved in both World War I and World War II. She told us that we should go see the Reims Cathedral. So we did. It really affected us all quite deeply, especially this one, who said, could I go and say
A prayer at the church.
That's right. When we asked her afterwards what she prayed for, she said that she sent a prayer up to
Sam.
To Uncle Sam, saying that we were there hoping
to find him.
That's right. When I told Helen that, she wrote back and she said, quote, your little one may not realize it, but that cathedral is extremely powerful, with St. Joan and St. Teresa, the little flower of Lisieux. I have never not had a prayer answered there, said Helen. So we kept on, and the next day, Rice was our chauffeur. He drove us to the Museum of War and Peace. Helen had been in touch with them before we came, thinking that their records might be able to give us some information about Sam. So we headed to the Meuse-Argonne area, and in the background is the Meuse River, which you've heard Rice mention. They had no information at all at the museum. They said that the Monuments Commission had no record of Sam being buried in any American cemetery in France anywhere. So they surmised that he must be in a local village. So we proceeded with Mila in the back seat as our lookout for church steeples and cemeteries. We found one, and we climbed out of the car to search, but it was a closed church with no adjacent burial ground. We did find out that, well, this is not really important, but there is a plaque inside that church in memory of the American officers who served France. They were so proud of the American support everywhere we went. So Martincourt was our next destination, as we had read of all the soldiers being buried in American cemeteries there. One church had a large cemetery on its hill, and it was closed too, because the French take summer holidays. So Mila and I noticed two little girls. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
And what were they doing? No.
They were just playing around the church.
That's right. And they didn't speak English. So we tried to, oh, okay. So we tried to explain to them what we were doing. They looked at us sort of, who are you? What are you doing? And we spelled out Mandell, the letters Mandell, and they understood that. And we sort of got them to come up with us. And we went up to the cemetery, we each took a section, and we walked down looking for Mandell. No luck. The grandfather came out and noticed us and said, and I explained to him in my poor French, what we were doing, and he said he'd go fetch the mayor, and we said no. By this time, we had realized that the gravestones were all in French, and we were in the wrong place. So we waved goodbye, saying,
Au revoir.
Again?
Au revoir.
Au revoir, and merci.
And merci.
And merci. So the girls waved to us all the way out the road. According to all the accounts and the maps that we'd found, we went to the most likely village, Latan. I asked the boys to stop and see if I could get out and go ask people. I tend to do that. I saw an elderly lady picking dead flowers outside her, picking dead hollyhocks off her flowers out in her garden. And she pointed that way. She kept pointing that way, which was up in this area. And so I said merci, and I walked down the road. I wasn't getting back in that car. I wasn't giving up. So I went down, I saw a driveway with some people in it working on a car, and I engaged them in my rudimentary French. Luckily, I remembered that I had a note with me written in French that one of those nice men in the Museum of War and Peace had written in French for me in case nobody could understand me. So the woman pointed too. She said, up there, up there. And she said, go up there and you'll see a boule. Do you remember the word boule?
Yeah,
And
it means ball in French.
in English, right. So she said that. So up we went, we parked the car. Rice went to the right, I went to the left. John and Mila stayed in the car on that trip. We couldn't find anything except Rice found barbed wire and a closed fence, and I didn't see anything, but I did hear the river. So we were discouraged at not finding the cemetery. It was getting dark, and we found that Mila was very patient in the back seat, but quite hungry, as we all were. It was about 7:30. We felt we should give up, and it was such a shame. So back down the hill, I said, I need one more chat with that woman who was so nice. Do you remember we went back? And, oh, by the way, they'd invited us to their barbecue that night, but we didn't go. So I came up and I went like this. Nothing. She said, come with me. She jumped into her Range Rover? Right, her Range Rover with her daughter, and she said, follow me. So back up the hill we went. She parked her car. She said, go this way. So we went inside the barbed wire and up the hill, and there was nothing but fields all around us. There was a copse of trees. It was a very thick forest, but it was very small. Mila, Rice, and I fought our way through the brambles and the over the brush, and we climbed over a manure pile and into the trees, and we thought, oh gosh, we're not going to find anything. All of a sudden we came upon a clearing where we saw a large
ball
with what on it?
A star on it. And we also saw like graves around on the side.
We did, but they didn't look like all the other graves because they were all in different positions. Some of them were broken. They weren't laid out in a formal row at all. Oh no, who's that?
You.
So that's one of the graves, and you can see how thick it was. I mean, nobody had named it. There was no insignia. There was nothing to tell you it was a grave. I think there were about 12 in all. Most of them were flat on the ground. There you are, discovering the bull. With who? Your dad? So we scratched away at the markings of the ones that were on the ground, and there was nothing we could see that had any markings on them at all. Rice went down the sides of the hills, and he said, Mom, come and look at this. And there was another one, and one broken in half. And so we sort of surmised that maybe pieces, yeah. But the bull was brand new. It was made out of cement, see? And it was brand new. We didn't understand. Nobody knew why, but clearly the French people in town knew. So somebody cares, and somebody had done that. So Rice surmised that maybe the result of the bombing of World War II had disturbed these, what were possibly graves. Now, of course, we know the rest of the story. We were really disappointed we couldn't identify it as Uncle Sam's grave to any degree of certainty, but we really felt there was a strong likelihood that that was where he was moved from the banks of the Meuse River up the hill to safety. So Rice went and planted the American flags, one just like Mila has here, there. There was a certain sense about it that drew us in, and when we heard the river and all, we just felt a real connection to Uncle Sam, didn't we? When we told Helen about our discovery, she was shocked that the town, the church, and the mayor had not done anything to recognize this site or to clean up and memorialize it. Certainly the villagers had respect and gratitude for these young Americans who died on their soil. Helen hopes that the War Memorial Overseas, Inc. will do something about it. I'm sure she will. Returning home after the trip, I went to my basement and unwrapped some old scrapbooks and old photo books that had carefully been wrapped up. Because we just weren't sure. We still didn't know he was back here. I came across a newspaper clipping in my grandmother, Lily, got the wrong grandmother, Emma Mandell Rice had, well, of course, she wasn't married then, but she had a clipping about her second brother's death, which happened 11 years after Sam died. And it was about his funeral. This would be James, who died from severe head injuries suffered during a polo game at Harvard. To my amazement, the very last sentence of that little tiny obituary said, "The body of James Mandell was taken to Mount Auburn Cemetery for burial beside that of the young man's brother, Lieutenant Samuel P. Mandell II, who lost his life in this war service as an aviator." It was really an epiphany. It was such a surprise. And the only reference to Sam, that was the only reference to Sam in the entire scrapbook. So I quickly called Mount Auburn Cemetery archivist. She located the burial site. First thing the next morning, John and I drove, and we found the gravestone, and we found the rest of the men, not these, but their ancestors, not you. No, you're still here. It was, and we thought, who are these people? They say Mandell too. So our question was this just a stone to memorialize Sam? Or was it, I think we could see it if we have it, or was he there? In the meantime, we contacted Emmanuel Church, where they had Sam's memorial service, happens to be John's church, and their archivist pointed out that a stained glass window in the vestibule commemorates the members of the church who died in World War I, and Sam is one of them. Tomorrow there's a service there at Emmanuel Church at 10. Then we found that in 1921 there was a service held for Sam in his parents' house here in Hamilton, because the churches were closed. Reverend Thayer from St. Mark's officiated that date, so we assumed that Sam's casket was on that pier a month before and had been sent home. It was a funeral and not a memorial, so we confirmed with Mount Auburn, and indeed the curator said their records showed the stone marked his casket burial. So, Uncle Sam, we
found him.
At last.
At last.
After three years after he'd been killed after you'd been killed, Sam, in service to your country, and only a few days before the armistice ending the Great War, you are buried with your family in Cambridge, Mass., and now we know for sure whatever happened to Uncle Sam. May you rest in peace.
We know little about the other 5 men who the community house has memorialized, but many of them were, in fact, immigrants. They may not have originally hailed from Hamilton and Wenham, but when called upon for help, they did not hesitate to fight and sacrificed their very lives to protect the rights of humankind. Many are memorialized at the town hall. The Mothers Club of Hamilton planted a tree for these and many local fallen heroes. November 12th. Dearest Mother, yesterday was a day worth living to see, wasn't it? The night of the 10th, I was sent out to carry orders for attack next day to the 26th and 2 other divisions. The 26th had a tough task that would have meant a lot of lives. 1 kilometer through the woods and then the capture of the Jumel Dorn, one of the strongest positions on the front. I had a swell limousine with 2 men on the box, and as I started out, it was a beautiful moonlit night. Verdun, as I went through it, was the loveliest thing you've ever seen. First the darkness of the great gates, then the tracery of the ruined buildings in the moonlight. It was like acres and acres of Melrose Abbey. The moon set early and a fog came up. The roads became morasses full of shell holes. Lights, of course, were forbidden and you couldn't see 5 yards. Before delivering the last order, the car got thoroughly bogged and I had to desert it, jump a truck, and finally stumble half a mile through the deepest mud I've ever seen, finally finding the HQ by following up through 2 barbed wire fences, a telephone wire on which I took most of the skin off my nose. On the way home, 1 bump nearly sent me through the roof, and an entirely invisible big gun went off right beside us and scared us all to death. I crawled into bed at 2 and naturally was hardly my sunny self when pulled out of bed at 6. My attitude rather changed when I was told I was to carry the orders for suspending hostilities. I telephoned to tip them off and then sailed out. Of course, I got bogged down in the same place as before and again borrowed a ride. The country was the box 10 days ago and is a mess of shell holes, wire, smashed machine guns, shattered horses, and oddments of equipment of all sorts. My machine dug out and joined me and we started home. The driver was the gay, devil-may-care type of Frenchman and was mad with joy. The result was that he gave the most skillful and reckless exhibition of driving I've ever seen, doing a sort of motor snake dance around trucks and under horses' noses. Every gun was busy getting in its last cracks at the box. At about 5 minutes of 11, they speeded up. Until 11, there was a perfectly continuous roar. Then as I topped the ridge above Verdun, there was a moment of silence. And then all the bells of Verdun rang out together. Victory, after 4 years. I lunched with the Corps commander. Modest lunch, including venison, beer, Burgundy, and champagne. He's the best type of older French officer, eloquent, courteous, and lovable, and it was wonderful to hear him talk of the 40 years' wait and what it meant to have them end victoriously. That night was a crazy one. In every direction, all along the lines, the troops were having a 4th of July, sending up every flare and rocket and burning every light there was. Pistols and rifles were going off everywhere, while windows at length were streaming light without fear of airplanes. Of course, there's no saying when we'll get back, but it is a relief to have it all over at last, not to have the reports of losses coming in every day. Best love to all. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of November 1918, the armistice was signed at a railway depot in Compiègne, France. It was the end of World War I, the war to end all wars. And yet somehow, that was far from reality.
George and Emily Mandell envisioned a lasting memorial to their son Samuel. In October 1920, the Mandells purchased land at the corner of Asbury Street and Main Street. Architect Guy Lowell and Hamilton builder Frank R. Trussell were commissioned to see the project through. As a tribute to Samuel, 165 family and friends of the Mandells joined together to commission a statue of Samuel for the portico of the community house. Beverly Farms native Anna Coleman Watts Ladd was selected to create the statue with Samuel's brother Thomas posing for the sculpture. The final work of art was kept secret from Mr. and Mrs. Mandell until October 9th, 1921, when the statue was presented to them along with a leather book containing the names of the 165 contributors. November 11th, 2018 marks the centennial of World War I and its armistice. The effects of the war to end all wars ultimately led to the founding of the community house, a gift that has benefited generations of local citizens for nearly a century. Today, the Community House continues on as a nonprofit 501c3 charitable organization that is dedicated to the arts and enrichment through programs that promote togetherness and strengthen our community. Throughout each year, the Community House offers a variety of concerts, theater productions, workshops, and special events that benefit the townspeople of Hamilton-Wenham and the surrounding communities. In 2021, the Community House will celebrate the organization's centennial. This is just the beginning of the story, I hope. There are many more stories to cover in the coming years and many more stories to write about this organization. To close our ceremony, I'd like to welcome Reverend Chaplain Dean Peterson to provide a special tribute to the 8 men who lost their lives here in World War I. Thank you.
In his poem, For Whom the Bell Tolls, John Donne writes, "No man is an island entire of itself. Each man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. The bell tolls for thee." The bell in the tower of John Donne's village church beckons all who are diminished by the death of the citizen, the neighbor, the friend, beckoned to gather in the circle of the grieving. 100 years have passed since our fellow citizens, our neighbors, our friends, our families have gathered in the circle of mourners to receive those who died during World War I. For all of us who have put on the uniform and gone down to the sea in ships, the bell is a familiar sound. During times of disaster and alarm, it rings wildly. During fog, very methodically. In more measured tones, it marks the passing of time aboard ship. In the mist of tradition, folklore, and legend, the United States Navy has rung the ship's bell when an officer has joined the ship's company or has retired. More specifically, the bell has been rung after taps have been sounded and before the body of a shipmate has been committed to the deep. Lastly, the ringing of the bell at 0800 hours, at quarters, is accompanied by these comforting and hopeful words. 8 bells, and all is well. In his poem, Crossing the Bar, Alfred Lord Tennyson writes the following: sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning at the bar when I put out to sea, but such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Twilight and evening bell, and after that, the dark. And may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark, for though from out our bourne of time and place the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. And now the bell is tolled for the 8 from our community, whom we honor, whom we have honored, and who we will continue to honor. Lieutenant Norman Prince, 15 October 1916. Major Augustus P. Gardner, 14 January 1918. Private Reginald Young, died 25 July 1918. Corporal Frank E. Nelson, died 23 September 1918. Corporal William W. Taylor, died 18 October 1918. Lieutenant Samuel P. Mandell, died 5 November 1918. Private Lester D. Hodgson, died 23 December 1918. Sergeant Major William J. Collins, died 1 March 1919. Final orders. These soldiers stood the watch and were on call when some of us were sound asleep in our beds. These soldiers stood the watch on foreign shores and here at home, while some of us were in school and relaxing on the beach. These soldiers stood the watch during those years when the winds of war were gathering on the horizon of history. These soldiers stood the watch and would cast a glance homeward to see their families and friends standing there. These soldiers stood the watch so that our families and friends could worship God freely, have freedom of the press, have freedom to assemble, and live in this land as our forefathers intended. These soldiers stood the watch so that we could sleep soundly in safety and enjoy the fruits of freedom. Today, these soldiers have stood their last watch. They are relieved of their duty. They are going home. Well done. Eight bells, and all is well.
I'd like to invite to the podium and introduce you to Senator Bruce Tarr, who has a proclamation he would like to make.
Thank you very much and good evening. I am honored to be here with all of you and honored to have participated as a witness to the presentation which has just occurred in this hall. It is hard to have witnessed what we just witnessed without being humbled and moved and touched. The events that we've heard about tonight happened 100 years ago, seemingly so far away in time. But thanks to these words and this presentation, they are here and as real for us tonight and now as they have ever been. And we realize the singularly important truth of all who have ever served. They were human, with human dreams, human aspirations, and a very human and unyielding patriotism. And all of them, regardless of their perspective, background, profession, or anything else, were united by that patriotism. In a way, we are united here by the very hall that we are in. And tonight has been a very fitting use of this space. I know that I will never again walk through those doors without thinking about this night and these brave men and the remarkable families they left behind and the legacy that has been entrusted to us as Americans, to never forget them and to honor them in every way that we can. The community center is a living, breathing symbol of that obligation and that ability that we have to come here, enjoy so many things that make life rich, and remember every time that all of those things are touched, memorialized, and honored by the sacrifice of the men that we have learned about tonight. And so it is with that that I come also on behalf of Representative Hill with a citation from the legislature which reads, "Be it known that the Massachusetts Senate and the House hereby extend congratulations to the Community House in recognition of your efforts to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of the Great War and to pay tribute to the World War I veterans from the town of Hamilton who lost their lives in service to our country. And be it further known that we extend best wishes for continued success and that this citation be duly signed by the President of the Senate in the case of this one and attested to and a copy thereof transmitted by the Clerk of the Senate. This is signed by Senate President Chandler. It is attested to by our Clerk, William F. Welch, And again, I am proud to offer it, along with Representative Hill, to an organization that lives the great promise of remembering, appreciating, educating, and inspiring. To the Community House, congratulations and thank you.
Love is so sweet in the springtime, when blossoms are fragrant in May. No years